Cool. I'm going to get started. I'm going to start talking. So welcome everyone to our fourth, I think, webinar in our summer webinar series. Today, I am going to talk about great expectations in hosted environments. So let's get started. So in terms of the structure of this webinar, if you've been to previous webinars, I'm reusing my slides, so this is going to be exactly the same what we've done before. I am going to do a quick intro to myself and people on the team who are here today. Then the main chunk of this webinar is about deploying great expectations in a hosted environment. What we'll talk about, first of all, I'm going to show you just a standard deploy of great expectations. Then we talk about what we mean by a hosted environment. I'll show you how to set up a data context in a hosted environment, add and modify data sources, store expectations, run validations, and then host and access data docs. The main thing we want to do today really is an extended Q&A session. So this is actually slightly different from the previous webinars that were mostly me talking and showing you stuff. In this case, when we talk about hosted environments, Databricks, EMR Spark, Azure is in there, although I will not show Azure examples because I haven't gotten that far yet. Google Cloud Composer, all these. There's a lot of fragmentation. There's a lot of different environments, and we figured we might actually just make this a little more interactive this time rather than showing you an example for each one. We'll be here to answer questions, which is why we have a few more folks from our core engineering team here today. Cool. So I'm really excited to have this be a little bit more interactive this time and less me talking. All right. In terms of communication modes, for the first half, I am going to do a little bit more of a presentation style webinar. Feel free, if you have questions while I'm talking, feel free to ask those in the chat. And I'm actually also going to open the chat so I can see it. So feel free to ask questions in the chat if you have them, and I will stop periodically to answer them. Or I might stop and read them out and then give them to someone else on the team to answer, because we've got a lot of smart people here today. We might answer some more in-depth questions via Slack afterwards if it's really like very specific to your use case, but we'll try again, like this time we're trying to be a little bit more interactive. We're recording the webinar. Content will be made available after, so if you have to drop off, that's totally fine. It'll all be made available within the next day or so, and also announced in the Slack channel again. Just a reminder that our community code of conduct also applies to our webinars. So please do read up on that and keep to our code of conduct. And then also Kyle, will you be posting a survey link again for, okay, cool. Kyle will be posting, oh, he already posted the survey, so fill it in now if you want, or post it in, fill it in after the session. All right, so let's get started. Quick intro. So who are we? Who are these people running this webinar, this open source project? We're Superconductive. We're the company behind Great Expectations. So Great Expectations evolved as a side project that some people were working on, and has now turned into a full-blown open source project with an awesome community. And Superconductive is kind of the company that started it all. We're a small 14, 15 people team. We have interns coming and going. I don't know how many we are right now. So small engineering team, we're fully distributed. I'm based in New York City. We've got a few people in the Bay Area. We're actually, every single person who's here today is in a different location, so it's pretty exciting. So for myself, I'm Sam. I'm the technical lead of the partnerships team. So my responsibility is working with all you wonderful engineers, data scientists to help you get the most value out of Great Expectations, both in terms of paid and unpaid partnerships. So we have consulting services too. We have Eugene here, who's our head of product. We have Kyle, who does DevRels, marketing, design community, all the things. We have Will, who's one of our product engineers. And then actually we do not have Alex, but we have Anthony Birdie, who is our VIP guest today and expert in all things hosted environments, who will be helping out. So apologies, Anthony. I think you got swapped you in at the last minute. Great, cool. Okay, let's get started. So I am going to, in order to explain hosted environments, I'm going to take a step back and just to set the stage. I don't know what the levels of familiarity are with Great Expectations in general. So I hope you've kind of played around with it already. If you're completely starting from scratch, some of these things might be a little foreign to you, but I'll try and set the context here. Obviously, Great Expectations is a open source Python library that you can basically just install in your environment using pip install if you have, a local machine or a remote server. And in order to initiate what we call a data context, so sort of setting up a Great Expectations project, you usually use your command line interface and run Great Expectations in it. So I can also, if I want to, I can show this real quick. Make this all smaller, so I can make their webinar. This is very small, so I'll make this bigger. And then I can run, and then I can run Great Expectations in it. Obviously, I'm in my virtual environment. I have terrible virtual environment hygiene and just install everything in my conda base. Holla if you're with me. Great, so Great Expectations ask you if you want to set up a data context, and then if you want to configure data source and everything. I'm just going to out of this. And then in my directory, I have this subdirectory called Great Expectations, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So this is how we usually instantiate a data context in GE. And now I am going to apologies for my keyboard shortcuts. Going to show you the what a Great Expectations setup usually looks like. So we have what your GE init creates is a subdirectory. We have here Great Expectations. This is the GE Getting Started tutorial that's actually in a repo, so you can totally clone that later and play around with it. And what the GE init gives you is the subdirectory with your directories where you store your expectations as JSON files, a bunch of directories to store notebooks, for plugins, for checkpoints, which are used to run validation. It has the uncommitted directory. So if you've been using Great Expectations at some point, you're familiar with that too, where basically all the stuff that we don't want to check into version control goes. And then the meat of your Great Expectation data context or Great Expectation deploy is really this Great Expectations.yaml file. Your YAML contains all your, to make this bigger, your YAML basically contains all the relevant configurations for Great Expectations to A, talk to your data, B, store any kind of expectations and validations result in whatever place you want to store it at. It will contain information about your validation operators, actions that happen after running validation. It will contain information on where to host your data docs, so the HTML output that comes out of Great Expectations, and a couple other things, including anonymous usage statistics. So the ge.yaml is, I call it ge.yaml short. The ge.yaml is sort of your main backbone of your data context. So going back to my slides, this is kind of what we consider to be a standard local Great Expectations deploy. You can take that directory, you can check it into version control, you can collaborate with your colleagues or with your team to create expectations, check them into version control, use those expectations, validate your data, and basically just treat this as, here's some stuff in our file system that we have. That does not quite work in a context that we call a hosted environment. So by hosted environment, we mean situations where we don't have a file system the way we're used to, and we also don't have a command line interface. So if you've, again, if you've used Great Expectations before, you do a lot of these, creating a suite, creating a data source, you do a lot of this using command line interface commands, such as Great Expectations Suite New. That might not always be possible. You might not have a shell or a CLI in that way. Some situations, some environments like that are Google Cloud Composer. This was kind of the first one, I think, where we went pretty deep on, oh, this is like, we are in a different world now. We've tried it out with Databricks, AWS EMR Spark, and like I said, Azure, I'm sure, also has its own version, which we haven't explored yet. If there's anyone here, if there's just a quick shout out, any Azure experts or anyone who's using Great Expectations on Azure, if you want to contribute documentation or how-to guides, we would absolutely love that, or help you work on those. Cool. So in those kinds of environments, we can set up Great Expectations differently. So it's not like Great Expectations doesn't work if you don't have a CLI. You can still do it. You just have to do it slightly differently. I'm not even saying it's harder. It's just different. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through the components of a Great Expectations deploy in hosted environments in terms of creating data context, in absence of Great Expectations in it. I'm going to show you how to add data sources, how to create expectations and then run validation. And I'm also going to talk about Datadocs hosting. Great. So first of all, we'll get started, and I'm going to pause after this section. I think so far it's been all fluff. I'll pause real quick. Are there any questions about sort of the meat, like what does Great Expectations do? Any kind of confusion, anything like that about the sort of the basics of the foundations of Great Expectations, or does that seem pretty clear to you all? Just post your question in the Slack, in the chat, and I can answer them. Otherwise, I'll move on. Just give me a sec. Okay, great. So I'll just assume you've probably seen some form of Great Expectations before, so this is not totally new to you. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to get started with creating a data context. So as I said, in a standard local deploy, your data context is managed in ge.yaml. I'm just going to repeat that a few more times, just in case it wasn't clear yet. And a host environment, we create this in code. Like I said, we've done this in a few different environments. All the examples I'm about to show are in our documentation. In one case, I'm actually going to show this in the documentation because my Composer environment did not work for this. Hey, live demos. But they're all, you will notice they're all very similar, which is kind of why we want to make this webinar more interactive, because if I show it once, you'll get it. Cool. Okay, so instead of running Great Expectations in it, I am going to open let's start with my Databricks Notebook. What I do here is, so if you're not familiar with Databricks, it is a hosted Spark environment that basically provides you an interface using Jupyter Notebooks. So we all love Jupyter Notebooks. It is very similar to AWS EMR Spark, or Spark on EMR. If anyone wants to tell me what exactly the difference is, like to me, because I'm interacting with the notebook, they seem pretty much the same. So the way you do it actually in both environments is you use whatever utility function you have to install basically like mirror the pip install version of actually installing the library. And then what you do is you import the Great Expectations library, and then you get started creating your data context. And this might seem a little daunting, but once I show you what it is, it's actually pretty clear. So the first step is I am creating a data context config, and then I'm scrolling down, and I'm passing that config into this base data context constructor to get my data context. Just a quick recap, the way I'm usually accessing my context object in a notebook or anywhere else is by just saying context is GE data context. This will read it from your YAML. This will look for your YAML file in your local directory or in your local directory structure, wherever it is you're running the notebook. Here, we are basically passing all the contents of that YAML into our constructor as a one big happy dictionary. And I think this is really the one thing that sort of is the missing link for a lot of users, where it's kind of like, okay, I have my YAML, but how can I do this in just in pure code without actually accessing YAML? So this is basically what you're doing. So I'm going to show this real quick, what the components are here. You have your data sources, and I'm really just flipping back to my YAML right now. And I have a key in my YAML called data sources. And my data sources, I have key value pairs for each individual data source. In this case, I only have one set up. The naming here is, that's the key. As you can see, it's a string, so it doesn't matter. And I'm telling it it's a Spark data frame asset, data set, and giving it some arguments here. So this is basically the same thing I would be doing here, the same keys, the same values. The next section that we have is our stores. So if I'm looking down here, I'm showing you, I have a section called stores. So the stores are where we store expectations and validation results as JSON files. And I'm going back, I'm doing a little bit, I hope y'all don't get dizzy here. You can see I have my expectation store and my validation store. I know I could make these side by side, but people might not have enough screen real estate to actually see that, so I'm doing the flipping. So I have expectations and validation store. I have my data docs side here, and again, in my YAML, I have my data docs side. So I am going to stop here and stop explaining all these, because I think this is probably sunken in yet. Now the question is, what are all the keys that we actually have to use here, right? Like, how do you know what these are? And the answer is, this is pretty straightforward. We actually have all of these in our documentation. So if you go to, for example, so we have EMR Spark and Databricks Spark. And what I've just shown for my Databricks thing, I just kind of copied and pasted this from here. So you don't have to memorize exactly what you need to put into your data context, but you can just use this from our documentation. Here's the plot twist. This seems really clunky and really annoying and really sort of, wow, this is a lot of typing. We are actually working on, and that's why I invited Alex, because he's one of the engineers working on this. We are working on making this significantly easier, basically cutting it down to, Eugene, can I call it a one-liner?
Pretty much, yeah.
Pretty much a one-liner to create your data context in a hosted environment. Depending on your environment, so you can have a Databricks default context or an EMR Spark default context that basically just gives you some default values to populate, so you don't have to do the whole thing. Stay tuned. I think this is probably going to into version 013, so the next major release, which will come out in a few weeks. And this will all be a lot easier, but obviously we want to support everyone right now. So this is kind of what you do, and you just look at it on in the documentation. So I'm actually, okay, there's some great questions here. Okay, so Anthony, I think you already answered Angel's question. So Angel's question was, what kind of objects are held in this mega dictionary? So I think me just sort of walking through this also showed it. It's exactly the same content as you have in the YAML. And then, ooh, this is a great question. So Martin has a question about the Snowflake SQL Alchemy implementation. I would table that. That seems like a very specific Snowflake question, which we're actually not covering in the environment. So Martin, if you're in the Slack, I think we might just take it there, or we'll just like answer it at the end. We'll make it up. A Snowflake question. I hope, Martin, I hope that's okay for you for now. Great point. And then yes, so Shubham, sorry if I'm messing up your name, asked if we can specify an S3 path to store expectations validations. Exactly. So actually, could you clarify if you mean specify an S3 path in Databricks or an S3 path in, here's the notebook I'm getting from, I don't know if you can see this, but this is from my EMR Spark environment. Was the question about Databricks to S3 or EMR Spark to S3? Could you clarify that for me? Databricks to S3. Fantastic question. I know Anthony and I were, so technically, yes. You should be able to store it everywhere. The only thing that is TBD that we have yet to figure out is authentication. So that's a fantastic question. And I think Anthony is on it. We did table it for this particular webinar. But yes, so technically you should be able, I can actually show this in my EMR Spark environment. Let me see if I can make this bigger. So where we have stores here, as you can see, so this is on AWS now. I'm flipping between my different environments. I got all the hosted environments. In the AWS environment here, you can see the keys are different for my stores. So for my expectations S3 store, my validations S3 store, the keys will be bucket and prefix because it's a tuple S3 store backend where I just specify the bucket and the prefix. Whereas in the Databricks environment, I'm giving it a base directory and referring to my DBFS path. So again, this is hopefully all in the documentation. If something is missing, please ping us and we can backfill it. But the keys that are needed here should be documented. As I said, authentication in S3 is TBD. Fantastic question. Authentication to S3 from Databricks. Stacking cloud onto cloud onto cloud. Great. Any other questions about the data context itself? All right. Great. So I'll get back to my slides, which here. Fantastic. Oh, sorry. The last one I wanted to also show real quick, but you probably get the idea by now, is the Composer version. So Google Cloud Composer, this might just be a very small segment of the population that I'm talking to here right now, but Google Cloud Composer is a hosted Airflow environment. The problem there is kind of the same that we have in other hosted environments where we don't have the CLI access, we don't have a typical file system where we can have a great expectations on YAML. So we also need to create our data context in memory or in code. In this case, you would be putting this data context basically in your DAG file. So Google Cloud Composer allows you to either upload a DAG file or sync it with your with a Git repo. And you basically just have to create everything in your DAG file in order then to access your context, load your expectations, and then run validation. So this looks very similar. One thing specifically that I want to call out is if you're, actually, I'm saving that for my data sources. So let's jump back to this. So this is, like I said, the same thing that you do in Composer. You put it in your DAG file. Great. So next up is adding a data source. Usually when we add a data source, we use the CLI, we use Great Expectations data source new, which then creates an entry in our Great Expectations.yaml. And by now you probably get the idea. I can also define my data source right here in my my dictionary when I'm creating my context. The one thing that might get a little hairy here is authentication. As always, one of the biggest problems in software engineering is always, how do I actually access that file? I can show one example, which I just meant to show with Composer, which is if you're connecting, so if you're in the Google Cloud environment now, and if you're connecting to a BigQuery data source, for example, you can specify your, so technically you can always specify your username, password, host name, and everything here. You probably don't want to do that in plain text. In a Composer environment, if you're connecting to BigQuery, you have a credentials.json file, right? And you can have that stored, for example, in, and this is, yep. This could be stored in a bucket, for example, or in some other location. I would love to actually hear from the rest of the GE team if there are any, if you have any experience with credential handling in other environments specifically, because that I think is the big question. Anthony.
Yeah, I can chime in a little bit. One thing you can do with Composer as well is set environment variables, just the same way you'll do in locally or with EC2 or any of the other things you're used to, and that way you can pull those in the DAG and import those to use those environment variables. That's just another way to do it.
Great. Yeah, so environment variables. So Great Expectations supports putting environment variables in your configuration. So you can also populate your dictionary here like this. This is definitely, it gets very interesting accessing, so being in one hosted environment and then trying to access data somewhere else in another hosted environment and handling authentication. So if there are any, again, I would love for everyone to share their experience. If there's documentation that you could provide that you could contribute to the project, things like that, we would love to hear more, mostly because there's an infinite number of permutations of what to access from where, and we can't cover all of them ourselves. So if anyone wants to like drop it into either make a PR for the docs or like add it to discuss, for example, anything that you figured out in terms of auth, we would love to hear from you. Great. Shubham had a question. Can we also specify the S3 source for the data sources in the Databricks or ge.yaml? Yes, you should be able to have a, I would actually like Eugene to ask because I haven't done it, but you should be able to point to have an S3 bucket as a data source, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Everything that you can specify in Great Expectations YML, you can specify in that mega dictionary that you're passing to create, to instantiate the data context object, yeah.
Do we have that? I'm going to do this live. How do you guys configure data sources? Do we pan as S3 data source? So we have, it would be, this is what it would, this is like a generator. Would it be this? Would it be the S3 glob reader fetch quarks generator?
Not necessarily. So you don't have to use the generator, right? If you just know which file you're loading, you can specify it in batch quarks when you actually loading it.
I think that might actually be a missing docs.
Yep.
Yeah, because I remember a user just asking recently about how can I just do S3 pointed at a file. So awesome! Thank you so much. This is super helpful. Crowdsourcing gaps. Great. Okay, so this is data sources, and like I said, authentication is definitely a little bit. You have to kind of figure it out. In this particular example, we're just grabbing all our stuff and storing all our stuff in the file system that we have access to in that particular environment. So I'm doing Databricks. I'm storing everything in DBFS and reading from DBFS. AWS, I'm accessing S3 buckets. Google Composer, I'm accessing Google Cloud Storage buckets. And that works seamlessly. So if you're crossing the boundaries, please do let us know. We're excited to find out. Awesome. Okay, so next up we have creating expectations and running validation. So again, typically we would run Great Expectations Suite new to create a new expectation suite. In this case, you also do everything in code. And I will very briefly show you the expectation stores, but we've basically touched on that already. So this is where you would be storing your JSON output. And then in order to actually create those expectations that you want to store, you will have to kind of do the standard thing you see, the boilerplate that you get from a standard GE workflow when you do it locally, which is creating the expectation suite, loading a batch of data, and then starting to create your expectations and then saving it. So what I'm doing here is so assume I have my context object, right? And I'm starting to, I have two data frames, Spark data frames that I'm just reading in some sample data that I have. So this is step one. It's the taxi data. If anyone has been in any of the previous webinars, you're probably familiar with it by now. And then I can start creating a new suite. And again, this is in absence of actually having a Great Expectations Suite new CLI. So I can say obviously my expectation suite name, and I'm just running the create expectation suite method from my context, passing in the name, and that gives me a new suite object. Currently, there's nothing happening here. The suite does get saved, so this already, create expectation suite already saves a blank JSON file basically with just a little bit of metadata, but there's nothing else in there. The next step is you load a batch of data. So I'm basically just, in this case, pointing it at my data frame that I've loaded and my data source, and then creating what we call a batch. So a batch just bundles your data set and it bundles your an expectation suite. So now you're ready to start creating expectations while getting feedback on those expectations because you bundled this with some data. And I'm actually going to explain that in a little bit more detail in a second. So once you have your batch of data, you can start adding your expectations. You could use profiling to automatically create some. In this case, I just created a single expectation using the expect column values to be between method. So this is kind of staged to my batch. If I execute it, again, I'm getting feedback because I've tied it to some actual data to, get some information of whether this is actually right or wrong. And then at the end, I'm saving my expectation suite in the cell. And that's pretty much it. So this is how I create my expectation suites. The next time around, I can either load my expectation suite from that particular expectation store. So this is kind of we call it the multiplayer mode. So if I'm the person kind of writing my tests and then we have another person who wants to run, or another process, right, or another team member, something else who wants to execute and actually run those tests, we want to also be able to load that configuration in a separate process. So we don't want all our code in one notebook. The other option is if we're just running everything in one go, I can also just run validation here. And again, all the content will be stored in that validation store that we've configured. So this is how I create expectations, save the expectation suite, and then run validation. Any questions so far? I am going to dive a little bit more into detail on the different sort of workflow or different models that I've just mentioned. Okay, great. Cool. So one of the topics that we wanted to bring up is tests testing as config, as configuration, versus testing as code. So if you're familiar with the standard Great Expectations workflow, it basically has two steps. You create your expectations, and then you have your expectations stored in your JSON. And then at some other point when new data comes in, for example, on a periodical basis, you load that expectation suite, you throw it at your new batch of data that's coming in, and you validate your data with your expectation suite and get those validation results. So this is what we call a test as config behavior, where really the JSON is sort of the shared artifact that is used to load the expectations and to run them. We can also have a slightly different pattern where we use tests as code, which means we do creation and validation at the same time in one go. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because, especially in hosted environments, this is a pattern that we see fairly frequently, where the question is, why do we actually save the JSON if I'm basically doing all my data loading, all my transformations, all the things in one notebook, sort of top to bottom, right? So one example I just want to show, well, one example I've already shown is basically you create your expectation suites here. You may or may not save them. If your notebook is sort of your source of truth, is that the only artifact that you're using, you can basically just get your results here. I'm actually going to see if this is, I did run it, so let's see what the result says. Cool. So results basically, wait, go, boop. Okay, so it's got a little bit of metadata. So results gives me for all my expectations in the suite, which is exactly the one that I have, gives me those validation results. Where is it? Oh my goodness. There's a lot of JSON in here. Sorry, everyone. Data docs action. Okay, so this is the result where it says success. There you go. There we have it. Success is true. So this means my my expectation that this column is between 1 and 6 actually holds true on this batch of data. And one thing I can do here, if I wanted to, is to basically just respond to that particular result and do something with it. For example, have an assert on it and then fail my entire notebook flow and my entire code execution if this task doesn't pass. So I actually have this example here on my basic notebook where all I'm doing is I'm saying, again, like I'm getting my result. This is the exact same code, slightly different parameters. And I'm saying, I'm just using an assert statement in Python, and I'm saying I want to assert that GE validation returns true, returns success, and I'm raising an error if that's not the case. So this is one example of tests as code, where you're basically just almost just using Great Expectations as a sort of convenience method for, writing a bunch of pandas that does it and then raising an assertion error, if that makes sense. So I just wanted to show those two modes of, one option is you just load your expectation suite, you create it, you save it in another process, you load it, you run validation, or you can do things basically inline at runtime. Cool. The last thing I want to talk about is Datadocs hosting. So Datadocs are basically a rendered version of your expectations and of your validation results. So because Datadocs is sort of the nice output, the nice artifact that you have in Great Expectations, ideally you'd want a rendered version of of that output hosted in a shared location so everyone on your team can access it, right? And again, Datadocs is configured in your data context. So this is the last thing I'm going to show, where if I just go back to my mega dictionary, what's the word for it? I can basically, again, just specify the data docs here. And in this case, I am putting it on my file store. Here's one caveat: authentication. Authentication and basically the linkability of those data docs is a little hairy, and you'll have to manage it yourself. So for DBFS, we did not get it to work to actually be able to just access the HTML. What you can do here is to just copy, because you have a command line, you can just copy the entire data docs directory and then have a local version, for example, of your HTML files to look at. Google Cloud Composer, you will have to set up, configure Google App Engine to actually be able to host the data docs. I think so far S3, if you make your bucket public, S3 is the one provider or hosted storage where we had good experience with it kind of just working out of the box. So just to throw that out, again, authentication is really like a big topic that gets a little hairy. So if there's any, again, knowledge, anything people can contribute, absolutely fantastic. Please do share. Anthony.
Yeah, just one reminder though, that data docs do have some potentially sensitive information. So you do definitely want to be careful about not, making your bucket public, if you do have sensitive information. So
Yes.
Just be careful. It definitely will work, but make sure you consider that.
Let's put it like that. I would not recommend this.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I mean, it's totally up to you. We have, so my bucket here is entirely, my S3 bucket is entirely public, and I can, like data docs works just, I'm actually wondering, yeah, data docs works just fine from my S3 bucket. The links all work. It's fantastic. I can send anyone that link. Do not make your buckets public unless you're 100% certain that like you're working with public data, for example, and that's fine if someone can access it. But again, authentication, setting policies on your buckets is definitely something that you'll have to figure out. This is, I think, it in terms of content for me. Yes, we have a Q&A. So given that we're not that many people this time around, and we kind of want to make this a little bit more interactive, I would actually love from people, like, please do unmute yourself if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question. Actually, Kyle, do you have a, or how about that? How about we use all the Zoom features.
You can unmute now.
Okay, yeah, use the raise hand feature maybe, so we can like at least go through people in order. Use the raise hand feature or thumbs up or whatever thing you can find, or post in the chat. I know the Zoom UI is a little opaque. Or wave, also cool. And then we can make sure it's your turn. Okay, so someone is waving and your name is actually, well, I'm asking to unmute you, so. Oh, Joey, okay, your name was like disappeared. That's odd. Okay, Joey, hey, how's it going?
How's it going? Good to see you guys. Great demo. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, I'm Joey. I'm one of the engineering managers at Shopify. So yeah, I talked to some of you guys before, and yeah, I'm just excited to see. I feel like that there's a really a lot of potential to the project. So I'm always looking for the opportunity to leverage it.
Thank you. That's awesome. That's exciting to hear. Awesome. Thanks, Joey. Any questions? Any specific environment? Does anyone have any environments, or does anyone work in any environments that we haven't covered here? So I know I've mostly focused on Composer, Databricks, EMR, Spark. Does anyone have anything that is not covered that we consider a hosted environment?
I mean, we usually use GC, like we use Google, so GCS. Yeah, particularly we also we use a lot of Parquet. So I don't know if that's something you guys had any experience with.
We do support reading in Parquet files, right, Eugene? Yep.
Yeah.
Parquet should work out of the box. Anyone else? Any other questions, issues, any problems you've run into? Creative Solutions. Arjun. Oh, sorry. Actually, Carlos was up first. Carlos said it would be great if we could create validation stores on Google BigQuery. That's a fantastic point. We currently, I think, support stores on Postgres only as the only sort of database backend. I think. Oh, James.
No, Sam's exactly right in terms of what we test against, but we have had customers who have used BigQuery as a database backend, a store backend, and the only kind of nuance is making sure that the configuration is just so. In fact, I believe that it requires the use of the credentials as opposed to a connection string. So there's a small difference from that, but other than that, I think we've been able to, hear people successfully use BigQuery. But we'd love to get more feedback on that.
Yeah, where's our BigQuery? Oh, so under workflows and patterns, I think in the Cloud Composer, like end-to-end workflow, again, I have, we have a BigQuery data source defined. So reading the data from BigQuery, but not writing to it. But I'm actually wondering if it's possible when you're doing the backend here, if you can also like pass in the URL for the credentials file, for example. Yeah, it's not something. So just go into our how-to guides for metadata stores. As you can see here, we only have Google Cloud Storage, and we have PostgreSQL as the only databasey thing. That's not like a bucket storage. Would love to get some reports on there. That was great. Okay, Arjun, you were next.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I joined in late, so I'm not sure if you guys covered the profiling section or not. I had a question regarding that.
No, we did actually not cover profiling at all.
Okay.
So is your question how to use profiling like in a hosted environment?
No, I kind of used that, and I was able to use the basic data set profiler, which sets its own expectations and it works completely fine. But the issue that I had is if I use another API, which is like the custom, it's a basic some other API call where you can set which expectations to have or not have, like include or exclude. In that case, the data types automatically get changed to unknown, like when we use that particular profiling.
Love it. I think that would be a fantastic question maybe to post either in Discuss or in Slack. I think that would be something to like look at. That would be helpful. Eugene, James, what's your preference for Discuss?
Discuss sounds good, yeah.
So if you go to our Discuss, discuss.greatexpectations.io. If you don't mind posting this here with like code snippets and stuff, we can take a look at that because that's super, super interesting. And we're actually working really hard on profilers this quarter. That's another thing that's going to go into that big release in the next few weeks, hopefully. It's going to be, 013 is going to be pretty epic. So profilers are definitely a thing that we're focusing on, so that might already solve that problem potentially, but obviously like we're here to help now with those problems and answer questions.
Sure. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks. We had another question. David asked if we tried GE in AWS outside of EMR. Glue, yes. That was why I wanted Alex to be here. So we have worked with one customer for our consulting services where we got it to work on Glue. I'm not sure, James or Eugene, you might be able to tell us what the status is.
I mean, pretty much the same procedure that Sammy described works on Glue, right? So programmatically instantiating a data context object and then running validation.
Got it. David, does that answer your question? Oh yeah, the glue. So if there's a Python shell, like you can basically do this and go to town.
I meant more like, I'm looking at the question, glue Spark job in particular, shell, I am not sure.
Okay.
I'm kind of like, you should, I mean, if you have a Python shell, you should be able to do stuff. So
I mean,
yeah, most likely we just didn't
yeah,
we didn't test it.
100% didn't test it.
okay.
Cool. Any other questions? These are great.
Any plans on integrating it with Athena? Sorry if you have already covered that. This is Arjun, by the way.
So there is actually a PR with Athena. It's not been merged yet. So as with any feature, more users voting for it pushes us to get it in.
Eugene, if you don't mind finding that PR, we don't have that many open PRs. I'm just posting it in the channel. And Arjun, if you want to comment on that.
Sure, that would be great.
Yeah, and also just see like what the diff is there, right? Any other questions? Anyone else? This is a fun environment. Okay, so we will be available in the Great Expectations Slack as usual. You know, Ben, who's our main point of contact for support, he's always around. And then a bunch of us are going to be around for a while. Oh, actually, Martin, I know had a question about Snowflake. So that might also be something we can, that might be a good question to ask. Let me scroll up. Snowflake. Yeah, that might be a fantastic question to ask. Also in Discuss, actually, if you don't mind posting it, Martin, because that seems like either a bug or a feature request, or just open a GitHub issue straight away if you're confident that it's
You know, in this case, I
it's not
think
supported.
GitHub issue, just based on your description.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Fair enough. That is a fantastic. So Martin, if you don't mind making a GitHub issue, that would be absolutely fantastic, because that seems like something that should be working. A, and B, we know we have a lot of Snowflake users, so you're probably not the only person who's run into that. Hope that helps. Hope that answers your question. Yeah, if you don't mind, so Martin was asking if it's okay to paste in the support channel. If you don't mind just dropping that into a GitHub issue, so we can do a little bit more async, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. Go the extra mile, and then people can look it up if it's not, it's more easily findable. You might have noticed we've like asked people to put stuff in Discuss and GitHub, just so that it's a little bit more shareable, because Slack obviously is a little harder to search and very transient. Great. So if we don't have any other questions, I will go back to my wrap up. So finally, thanks everyone for joining. This was awesome. I loved all the questions. Great Expectations is an open source project. We are a community. So please do join the community, join the Slack if you haven't yet. I assume everyone's on the Slack at this point. Oh, greetings from Uruguay. And check out our docs as usual. Join our Slack channel. Star us on GitHub. Please do star us on GitHub. It gives us an awesome impression of who's doing what. And please fill in the survey that Kyle's posted. And final plug, little round of advertising here. We offer partnerships and consulting services. So if you want to have a direct line to the GE experts to answer those kinds of questions or help you implement stuff, we do hands-on keyboard work. So we do paid consulting services. Please do hit us up. So this is at superconductive.com, which is the company behind Great Expectations. like and subscribe. That's it. Thanks, everyone. Abraham, we'll follow up with you in the Slack if that's okay, because we're almost
Perfect. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, Sam. It was great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.